Story 1. The intake interview. The first time the patient spoke, the snow was hitting the intake windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of dry rice thrown against glass. He had been sitting across from me for almost 40 minutes, hands folded, wristband blank, transfer packet empty except for a photocopied face sheet with no name. When he finally raised his head, he did not ask where he was or why he had been brought in. He looked directly at me and said in a calm voice I can still hear with perfect clarity that I should skip the opening questions because we had already done this interview 3 times before, and each time I forgot a little more. I was a psychiatric counselor at a private crisis center in Brooklyn in the winter of 2026. The center handled walk-ins, police transports, emergency psychiatric evaluations, and overnight stabilization. Holds for patients too acute to send home and not yet appropriate for a full inpatient bed. My job was to complete psychosocial assessments, suicide risk screenings, collateral contact attempts, and disposition notes for the overnight attending. Overnights were usually procedural: vitals, property inventory, search and secure, initial nursing triage, observation level assignment, intake interview, reassessment at change of shift. That week, with snow burying the city and staff sleeping in offices between doubles, even routine work felt sealed off from the outside world. The patient arrived after 11 p.m. from a satellite urgent care in southern Brooklyn. Psychiatric transfers normally came with a face sheet, medication list, nursing note, legal status, and transport documentation. What arrived with him was 2 pages, one duplicated, no identifying photograph, no electronic pre-admission in the system. The transporter said the sending facility had suffered a network outage during the storm. His handoff was brief. Male patient, cooperative, no overt violence, no known substances, found sitting in an urgent care waiting room after closing, would not provide a name, had what the nurse called profound identity disturbance. Then he signed and left. The patient was clean, alert, and dressed for the weather. We inventoried his belongings in detail because property mistakes became liability reports. His wallet contained no identification, no bank cards, no receipts, no photographs. Just an empty card sleeve and $2 in quarters. When I introduced myself, he watched my mouth with a concentration that did not fit catatonia or intoxication. He accepted the hospital scrubs but never changed into them. He kept his coat on until I asked twice, politely, because ligature policy required it. He removed it, folded it neatly over the back of the chair, and sat with his hands flat on the table as if he had been instructed where to place them. I began the way I always did. I confirmed whether he understood where he was. I explained the purpose of the interview, the limits of confidentiality, and the possibility that information would be shared with the attending psychiatrist for treatment planning and safety. I asked for his full legal name, date of birth, and current address. He said nothing. Silent patients were not rare, so I shifted to orientation questions. Did he know the month? Did he know the city? Did he know why he had been brought in? He stared at the reflection of the ceiling light in the tabletop and kept breathing slow and even. I documented what I could. Poor eye contact at times. Motor behavior within normal limits. No obvious tremor. No psychomotor agitation. No overt response to internal stimuli observed during interview. Speech absent. Affect difficult to assess. Thought process unable to evaluate fully. Insight and judgment unable to assess. I marked several fields as deferred pending reassessment. The first irregularity appeared when I opened the electronic intake form for unidentified patients. Our system automatically assigned a temporary medical record number beginning with a string reserved for emergency aliases. The number generated, then vanished. The field went blank and the cursor jumped to the signature line at the bottom of the page. I assumed the network was lagging. Storm weeks did that. I refreshed the chart. When the form reopened, half the fields had populated themselves. Chief complaint read return visit. Evaluator read my name. Disposition read pending continuation. The arrival time listed was 3:17 a.m. even though the wall clock in the interview room said 11:52 p.m. and I had signed the transport paperwork no more than 20 minutes earlier. I deleted the fields, saved, and got an error message stating that an assessment already existed for this encounter. Broken software annoyed me more than it unsettled me. I called the unit coordinator at the front desk and asked whether registration had accidentally merged this patient with another chart. She checked and said there was no chart to merge. She created a paper alias bracelet manually, writing John Doe on it in black marker, then sent it back with an aide. The patient looked down at the bracelet in my hand before I fastened it. He said quietly, "That one never stays on." It was the first thing he had said. I asked him to repeat himself. He looked at me, not frightened or confused, sympathetic. "You always start with orientation," he said. "Then you ask whether I know where I am. Then you ask who I can call. Then you stop writing when I mention your apartment." I felt the kind of cold awareness clinicians are trained not to show. Patients tested boundaries all the time. You learn to keep your face neutral. I told him we had not met before. He gave the faintest shrug. "Not on this shift," he said. I continued the interview. That was what training was for. I asked if he was experiencing thoughts of harming himself or others. He said, "Not tonight." I asked if he was hearing or seeing things other people could not perceive. He said, "Only when you leave." I asked if he had been admitted to psychiatric facilities in the past. He said, "You filed those." Then he folded back into silence. I changed tactics and reviewed observable facts aloud, partly for clinical grounding, partly to test his responses. I stated that he appeared approximately mid-30s, well-nourished, no visible injuries, no obvious intoxication, no slurred speech, no gross disorganization. I asked if any of that was inaccurate. He said, "You should add sleep-deprived. You always forget that part when it matters." I wrote nothing for a moment. Then I asked him how he knew I was sleep-deprived. He answered without pause. "Because you fell asleep in interview room 2 on Monday after the woman from Queens said the vents were counting backward. You woke up with a crease from the clipboard across your face and told Nurse Bell not to mention it." Nurse Bell did exist. She had covered Monday, and I had, in fact, nodded off for what I believed was less than a minute near the end of shift after nearly 18 hours awake. No patient had been in the room at the time. I remembered that clearly because I had been embarrassed by it. I asked who told him that. He said, "You did. Last time you were trying to prove you could still remember ordinary things." At that point, I ended the interview on the stated rationale of allowing the patient to rest before reassessment. I escorted him to an observation room near the nursing station where staff could maintain line of sight. He walked without resistance. Before sitting on the bed, he touched the edge of the door frame with 2 fingers and looked back at me. "If you check the archive," he said, "start with winter. You only disappear in winter." For the next hour, I reduced what had happened into smaller explanations. Maybe staff had discussed me in front of him. Maybe he had overheard names at urgent care. Maybe the chart had pulled remnants from an old encounter. None of it explained Monday, but fatigue can make coincidence feel designed. I reviewed the paper transport note again. It listed sending physician pending and transfer reason psychiatric evaluation. Under patient name, there was a handwritten line. The ink had bled from moisture, but I could still read it. Previously known to service, no one on the overnight team recognized him. Nurse Bell said the face did not look familiar. The unit coordinator confirmed there was still no electronic chart, No scanned identification and no previous registration under the temporary alias. The sending urgent care said detailed records would have to wait until morning. Around 1:30 a.m., after 2 more crisis evaluations and a restraint debrief for another patient, I returned to reassess him. He was sitting exactly as I had left him, back straight, hands folded in his lap, eyes open. I asked if he was more comfortable speaking now. He said, "You ask that because you dislike silence. It makes you think you missed a cue." That was not intimate knowledge exactly. It was perceptive, but patients could be perceptive. I asked for his name again. He said, "Which one do you need? The one on the bracelet, the one on the unsigned forms, or the one you used when you still had an office with a window?" I had never had an office with a window at that facility. He described a room with pale blue paint, a clicking radiator, and a crooked evacuation map. He said I kept a legal pad in the second drawer because the computer froze whenever snow hit the wiring on the north side of the building. It did not sound like pure fabrication. It felt like a memory just out of reach. I terminated the reassessment early and went to records. Our archived evaluations were stored in a hybrid system because the center had changed ownership twice. Recent encounters were electronic. Older documentation, especially from before a renovation, had been scanned in batches with poor indexing. Staff avoided the archive unless billing or legal forced the issue. I searched by my employee number first, mostly to prove to myself that the patient had triggered some kind of clerical cross-reference. The screen returned 28 documents. That was wrong immediately. I had worked there just under 2 years. I had written hundreds of notes. My active charting was not hard to find, but archived scans under my employee number should have been 0. The earliest file was dated January of 2022, 4 years before I started at the center. I opened it. Psychiatric intake reassessment. Overnight counselor signature Daniel Mercer. Employee number matched mine exactly, digit for digit. The note described an unidentified male brought in during a snow emergency, cooperative but minimally verbal. Prior contact with evaluator suspected, identity uncertain, follow-up interview recommended due to memory discontinuity. The phrasing was mine in a way that made my stomach tighten. Not just professional language, specific habits. The way I used semicolons in narrative notes. The way I wrote no acute response to internal stimuli instead of the shorter standard template. I checked the scanned signature. It looked like mine after a long shift, when the final letters flattened. I opened another file, then another, different dates, same winters, same unidentified patient or patients under aliases that had been blacked out in scanning. Same themes, missing collateral, conflicting arrival times, notations about evaluator fatigue. One included a line that made me stop breathing for a second. Patient reported prior sessions occurring between scheduled shifts. Evaluator unable to rule out confabulatory overlap. I printed 3 files and checked my phone to anchor myself. 2:38 a.m. My sister had texted asking whether I was sleeping at the hospital again because the roads were getting worse. More troubling was my call log. There was an outgoing call from my phone to the crisis center landline at 4:11 a.m. the previous Thursday, lasting 9 minutes. I had no memory of making it. I asked the coordinator for prior schedules, saying payroll needed confirmation of storm coverage. On the prior week, there were 2 overnight shifts highlighted in yellow with my initials beside them. I remembered working one. I did not remember the other. The week before showed another shift I could not place, then another in January. Double coverage approved, intake overflow, staff room cot assigned. I looked up at the observation board. The patient was no longer in his room. My body reacted before my mind did. I was halfway down the corridor before the aide called after me that he was back in interview room 2. No alarm had sounded. No one had signed him out for reassessment. Yet there he sat at the table where I had first interviewed him, my printed archive notes stacked neatly in front of him. "You left those," he said. I told him he was not permitted to handle staff documents. "You say that every time," he replied. "Then you sit down because you already know they're about you." I remained standing, training again. Control the frame, keep boundaries, ask direct questions. I asked his name. He said, "Daniel is close enough." I asked whether someone at the center had coached him. He said, "No one here remembers on purpose. That's why the paperwork works better than people." He pushed the top page toward me with one finger. I looked down. A line had appeared at the bottom of the printed note that had not been on the screen when I opened it. Evaluator requested self-audit due to recurrent post-shift amnesia. The ink was the same gray-black as the scan, not fresh, not handwritten. As if the sentence had always been there and I had somehow failed to read it until now. I told myself I was under acute stress and needed to report concerns to the attending. I knew that. Instead, I sat down. He smiled with tired recognition, the way patients sometimes did when a clinician finally asked the real question. "What happened to me?" I said. He considered that. "You kept trying to finish the interview," he said. "That was the mistake. The center doesn't discharge incomplete things. It stores them, notes, holds, voices. People when they're easy to misfile. You noticed the wrong chart during the first snowstorm, and after that they had to keep deciding whether you were staff or content. Some nights they choose one. Some nights the other." I asked who they were. He looked at the ceiling speaker in the corner of the room. So did I. It clicked once, the way the intercom did before a page, but no announcement followed. Then my computer at the desk outside began printing. We both heard it, page after page after page. I walked out to the station and found the printer generating intake packets with no request attached. Each page bore the same temporary alias field left blank. Evaluator Daniel Mercer. Arrival time 3:17 a.m. Disposition pending continuation. On the final page under patient signature there was a line already completed in my handwriting. I have reviewed the foregoing and confirmed that the above is accurate to the best of my memory. The date on the form was January 12, 2022. I had not been employed there then. I had been living in Queens, working community outreach and applying for graduate licensure hours. I knew that as fact. I said it aloud to myself as if reciting orientation questions. When I turned back toward interview room 2, the patient was standing in the doorway. The blank wristband had come loose and fallen open. The inside surface, which should have been empty, carried faint printed text. "Mercer, Daniel." He saw me read it. "You always think the discovery is the end," he said. "It's just the point where the rolls stop holding." The overhead lights dimmed as the building shifted to backup power, then returned. In that brief change, I had the impression the corridor was narrower and painted the pale institutional blue he had described. When the light steadied, the walls were normal again, but the evacuation map beside the interview room door hung crooked. I had never noticed that before. The attending arrived from the inpatient side a few minutes later after I stopped answering the unit phone. The patient was gone. Not eloped, not hidden, simply gone. Security cameras showed no movement out of the room, and the room itself was empty except for a folded coat containing my transit card. They sent me home at daybreak under the language of exhaustion. Records later told me the archived scans had likely been misindexed during migration. The unit coordinator swore the patient had never been registered because no patient had arrived on that transfer at all. I resigned 3 weeks later after taking leave I barely remember requesting. I still have photocopies of the archived evaluations, though every few months I check and find one page less than before. When heavy snow starts after midnight, I do not answer calls from unknown numbers. They always come from Brooklyn. I no longer believe institutions forget by accident. I think they file what they cannot explain wherever there is room. And sometimes that room is a person. After what happened in Brooklyn, every locked hallway and every blank form in a hospital felt less like administration and more like storage. Story 2. The Observation Wing. The call button in room 12 sounded through the dead corridor at 3:20 a.m., and that was the moment I understood the building was not malfunctioning. The sound came through the old intercom speaker with the softened crackle of analog wiring, followed by a man's voice asking for his night medications in the calm, practiced tone of someone who had made the same request for years. I was standing in front of the welded access doors to a wing maintenance had sworn was empty. The lock plates were cold under my flashlight beam, the hinges sealed with fresh paint, and yet the speaker above my head clicked again and repeated the request, this time using my last name like we had met before. In the autumn of 2011, I worked graveyards for the Public Safety Department at a state-operated mental health center outside Buffalo. The campus had been expanded in phases since the middle of the last century, and by the time I got there, it looked less like a single hospital than a collection of connected intentions. There were newer brick additions with badge readers and tamper alarms, older concrete blocks with wired windows and narrow day rooms, service tunnels, boiler access, and one long administrative spine that linked buildings people still called by names, no longer used on official maps. Some units were active, some had been mothballed. A few were technically condemned but still received occasional maintenance because the state was deciding whether renovation cost less than demolition. My job was not clinical, but if you worked overnight security in a psychiatric facility for more than 6 months, you learned the rhythms well enough to understand where safety ended and treatment began. We handled perimeter patrols, visitor access after hours, elopement response, staff escorts, contraband findings, and duress alarms. We also helped when a patient needed transport between units, because certain wings required 2 staff members in line of sight even for a short move through a hallway. Most of us came from either corrections, private security, or emergency services. I had done 3 years with campus security at a community college and 1 year working ambulance dispatch before taking the state position for the benefits. Graveyard shift was quieter than people imagine. The loud parts were sudden, but most of the night was routine. Badge checks, fire panel reads, logging exterior doors every hour, watching old camera feeds roll in black and white or low-grade color from fixed angles that made every corridor look longer than it was. The monitors sat in a control room off the main lobby where the air always smelled faintly of dust and overheated plastic from the recorder cabinets. The newer buildings fed into a digital system, but several older units still recorded to VHS through a multiplexer. We labeled tapes by date, building, and camera bank, then stacked them in a metal cabinet until records boxed them for storage. The restricted area at the center of what happened was an older section called the North Observation Wing, though by the time I was hired, nobody used that name in normal conversation. On the current floor plan, the space existed only as a blank rectangle between Cedar 3 and an abandoned occupational therapy suite. Maintenance referred to it as the sealed corridor. The older officers called it North OBS when they forgot themselves. It had once been a high-observation psychiatric unit, the kind built decades earlier around a central nurse station with single rooms, safety glass, and a long hall designed for clear visibility from end to end. It had been shut down years before I arrived after a pipe burst, mold remediation, and some larger administrative decision I never got a straight answer about. I first noticed it because of motion alerts. The control room still received intermittent trouble signals from disconnected systems, and everyone knew not to overreact to old wiring. A door contact could chirp once because of humidity. A camera could flicker static when wind hit the outer conduit. But in late October, during a week of lake-effect rain and hard wind off Lake Erie, the old monitor labeled North Hall began registering motion after midnight. The image came and went through horizontal distortions, but when it cleared, I could see what looked like movement at the far end of the corridor. At first, I assumed it was lighting fluctuation. Then I saw a figure cross from one room to another. I rewound the tape and watched again. The person appeared only for a second. White scrub top, slow gait, no identifying features. I logged it as possible maintenance presence and called the facilities desk. The on-call mechanic told me no one was working in the sealed corridor and suggested mice had triggered the sensor. That was enough of an answer for that night. The next night, the same alert returned. This time it was followed by an intercom tone from a panel that should have been disconnected. The old observation wing still shared parts of its audio routing with the main security board because no one wanted to spend the money separating out dead infrastructure. Usually that meant static bursts and occasional false clicks. What came through at 1:50 a.m. sounded unmistakably human. "Nurse station," a voice said. "Medication round is late." The message was short and distorted, but clear enough that the officer beside me turned in his chair and asked whether Cedar 3 had rerouted a call by mistake. We checked. Cedar 3 was quiet. Their nurse confirmed all patients were accounted for and no one had touched the intercom. I wrote an incident note and mentioned it to my supervisor the following morning. He read it, rubbed 2 fingers over the bridge of his nose, and told me not to go looking for ghosts in retired infrastructure. He said the audio lines in that part of the campus picked up bleed from active units all the time, especially in bad weather. Then he told me to log all future occurrences and keep the language objective. That became the pattern. Objective language for events no one wanted described plainly. By early November, the alerts were regular. Motion in North Hall. Door tone from room 8, static. A voice asking for water. A hand briefly visible behind the wired window of room 11. Every time I checked access logs, the sealed doors showed no badge activity. Every time I called maintenance, they said the corridor remained offline and empty pending demolition approval. The work order sheet taped in the service office listed the entire wing for asbestos abatement the following spring. Empty for years. No entry except authorized crews. My own part in it might have ended at nuisance documentation if not for a patrol I should never have made. During overnight rounds, officers were expected to verify the physical condition of exterior doors and major interior access points. You did not enter clinical areas without reason, but you did walk the connecting spines and utility hallways. One rainy night around 2:45 a.m. after the 3rd North Hall motion alert in 6 hours, I decided to check the sealed corridor from the physical side rather than the monitor. The route took me through an unused rehab hallway, past stacked wheelchairs and down a service passage where half the fluorescent tubes had burned out. The walls there still carried the older institutional green under newer paint. My radio popped with intermittent static because the concrete thickened around that section. When I reached the fire doors blocking North OBs, I found exactly what I expected to find. Chain bracket removed years earlier. Magnetic locks dead. Door seam painted over after closure. A laminated notice reading no through access. No sound from inside. Then my flashlight landed on the observation window set into the left door. There was light in the corridor beyond. Not full light. The dim yellow-white spill of night fixtures left on low. Enough to show a waxed floor, the base of a chair rail, and the shadow of movement passing across the opposite wall. I radioed control and asked whether any crew had been granted access. Control said no. I asked whether they still had camera on North Hall. They said the image was live and empty. That mismatch should have been enough for me to leave it alone. Instead, I put my face to the glass. I could see down maybe 20 feet of corridor, closed doors on the right, a nurse station window farther in. On the wall opposite the station, someone had posted patient rights material in the old state format with the heavy blue header they stopped using years earlier. The paper looked faded but intact. At the end of that short visible stretch, a person in hospital pants moved behind the station glass and disappeared. I told Control I had visual confirmation of occupancy. They asked whether I was sure I was looking into North Obias and not a reflection from Cedar 3. There was no angle for that. The fire doors opened into concrete, no cross corridor, no reflective glass behind me. By the time my supervisor met me with a facility's key ring, the light behind the window was gone. He tried 3 keys without success, then called the maintenance foreman at home. The foreman arrived 20 minutes later, annoyed and half-dressed under his coat. He used a separate key, opened the outer latch and showed us a short passage ending in a cinder block wall. No corridor, no nurse station. Just sealed space where the wing had supposedly been cut off during renovation. I stepped forward and ran my hand over the blocks. Dry dust, fresh enough mortar lines. My supervisor looked at me in the expression older men use when deciding whether someone is stupid or exhausted. On the radio, Control reported the North Hall camera had gone to static for 7 minutes, then returned to normal. I did not sleep well after that shift. Not because I thought the place was haunted. I still believed there had to be an architectural explanation, some misread line of sight or obsolete feed routing. But the certainty I depended on at work had shifted. In hospitals, locked doors matter, floor plans matter. If they stop mattering, every other rule starts to look optional. I began keeping copies of the motion logs in a notebook I carried in my jacket. Not official copies, just dates, times, camera labels, what I saw, what Control reported, who denied what. I did it because the official incident summaries kept getting simplified. A voice over intercom became possible audio artifact. Visible person became unverified movement. Light and sealed area became officer reports reflection. Each revision was defensible on its own. Together they felt like sanded edges. One night near Thanksgiving, the old intercom activated again while I was alone in Control. The speaker popped, hummed, and delivered a short burst of feedback. Then a woman said, clearly enough that I wrote her exact words down as she spoke them. "Can someone check on the new guard? He keeps missing the count." I froze with my hand over the recorder controls. There was no count in North OBs. Not anymore. Not for years, if anyone was telling the truth. More importantly, there was no one else in control to hear it, which meant if I reported it, the message would become just one more subjective note attached to my name. I dubbed the tape anyway. We were not supposed to duplicate security media without authorization, but the process was simple on the older machines. Play one deck into another. Mark the shell with grease pencil. I started doing that more often after that night, taking home copies of unusual footage because I no longer trusted the cabinet to keep a stable record of anything. The real break came from the archive room in the basement. Records and retired media were stored in a climate-controlled area beside old biomedical equipment no one had tagged for disposal yet. I had reason to be there because a staff theft review required footage from a separate building. While waiting for the clerk, I noticed several shelves of unlabeled VHS boxes from discontinued camera banks. North Observation, East Isolation, Annex Day Room. Handwritten dates going back more than a decade. I signed out nothing. I just memorized the shelf and came back on my meal break with a card. The first tape that mattered was from January of 2006. Snow outside on the grainy exterior camera. North Ob's nurse station active. 3 patients visible in day room chairs. A tech pushing a medication cart. Nothing dramatic. Then the timestamp rolled to 2:14 a.m. and the camera at the far end of the hall caught a uniformed officer walking past the station window. It was me. Not someone who looked a little like me. Me. Same narrow shoulders, same receding hairline at the temples, same habit of touching the radio mic before speaking even when I had not pressed transmit yet. The uniform patch was the old style, but the face turned enough toward camera for me to recognize it completely. In 2006, I was living in Rochester and working campus events. I had never been to that facility. I checked the tape jacket for mislabeling. The date was written twice. I pulled another tape at random from March of 2004. North OBS again. Same corridor, different patients. At 1:11 a.m., an officer crossed frame carrying a clipboard. Same face, same walk. I wish I could say I handled that discovery rationally. I did not. I spent the next hour pulling tapes and feeding them into the old review deck until my hands smelled like oxide and dust. On several recordings across several years before my employment, I appeared in the background of the wing. Never centered, never acknowledged. Passing a doorway. Standing at the nurse station, escorting someone just beyond clear view. Once looking directly into the camera as if I knew where it was mounted. The archive clerk found me there and asked what I was doing. I told her I was reviewing continuity footage for demolition planning, which was not convincing but good enough for her to decide it was someone else's problem. When I brought one of the copied tapes to my supervisor, he watched less than a minute before ejecting it. He said the date encoder on obsolete media often overlaid incorrect times and that analog distortion could create facial resemblance where people wanted to see patterns. I asked whether the wing had really been closed. He said yes. I asked whether it had ever carried a different name. He said I was getting too invested in dead space. Then he advised me, not unkindly, to use some vacation before I made myself look unstable in front of administration. After that, the denials widened. A nurse from Cedar 3 told me she had worked there 8 years and had never heard of North OBS. A maintenance man who had personally opened the sealed door for me said later he thought we had checked a disused supply stub, not a former patient wing. The campus map in the control room lost the faint pencil notation that had once labeled the blank rectangle. Even the monitor label changed one night from North Hall to camera unassigned, though the feed remained the same corridor. The more I tried to anchor facts, the less fixed they became. I even requested old unit census sheets from administration under the excuse of comparing room numbers before demolition. The packet that came back skipped from Cedar 3 to the occupational suite without any gap at all, but the page numbering was wrong. One page had been removed cleanly as if the building had been edited by hand. During my final patrol through the area, snow had started early, wet and heavy, and the whole campus reflected a milky haze through the windows. The alert came at 3:20 a.m. motion, North Hall. Then the old call button tone. I went alone because I no longer believed anyone else would admit to hearing what I heard. At the welded doors, the intercom clicked and a man asked for his night medications. Then he said with patient irritation, "Officer Grady, count is wrong again." That was my last name. I put my eye to the window. The corridor was fully visible this time, deeper than before, extending past rooms marked 10, 11, and 12 in black numerals on white placards. The nurse station light was on. A clipboard hung from the counter. On the far wall, a round clock read 3:20 a.m. My radio said 3:12. I backed away and checked my wristwatch. 3:12. When I looked through the glass again, the corridor clock had advanced to 3:13 while the second hand on my watch still ticked through 3:12. Then I saw the officer at the nurse station. He was facing away at first, bent over a log book, When he straightened and turned, I watched myself from 8 feet away and at 5 years older on tape and at the same age all at once. He picked up the wall phone, listened, then looked directly toward the window where I stood. His mouth moved before the speaker above me activated. "If they tell you this wing never existed," my own voice said through the intercom worn thin by old wiring, "check the count sheets. They erase rooms last because rooms hold shape longer than records do." The corridor lights dimmed. Somewhere inside, a patient began knocking rhythmically on a door. Not frantic, controlled, like someone reminding staff of a procedure. I stepped back so fast I hit the opposite wall. When I raised the flashlight again, the window showed only darkness and my own reflection. I turned in my notice 2 days later. Human Resources coded it as resignation for personal reasons. Administration approved demolition funds the following spring, at least according to the internal memo I saw posted briefly before it vanished. I drove past the campus once a year after that on visits to my brother in Cheektowaga, and the connecting block where North Obi is had been always looked intact. No sign of demolition. No external scar where a wing had been removed. I kept the copied tapes in a storage bin for years until mold took most of them. One still plays. The image rolls, the tracking drifts, and for maybe 12 seconds you can see me walking the far end of a corridor I was never hired to protect. I do not know whether the hospital was hiding abandoned patients, preserving a unit it could not admit existed, or letting certain pieces of itself remain active after paperwork said they were gone. I only know that institutions do not need to remember you in order to keep using your name. Sometimes the cameras do that for them, and sometimes the cameras keep watching long after the rooms are supposed to be empty. Story 3. Patient 9B. By the time I understood that the patient in bed 9B was not predicting the hospital's future but repeating it, I had already signed my name to the same discharge order 3 times. The pager on my hip kept vibrating with consult requests that matched conversations I had not had yet, and the patient watched me from the corner bed with the exhausted patience of someone waiting for a junior doctor to catch up. When I checked the electronic chart for the order I had just entered, it was gone again. In its place was a progress note time-stamped 5 hours ahead, written under my login documenting that I had returned to the room, changed my recommendation, and agreed the patient should remain admitted indefinitely for observation. I was a second-year psychiatry resident at a large teaching hospital in Manhattan during the summer of 2025, when staffing shortages had turned every schedule into a negotiation with collapse. Our program covered psychiatric emergency evaluations, inpatient units, consultation liaison work for the medical floors, and overnight cross-coverage when enough people called out sick, burned out, or simply vanished into approved leave that kept getting extended. In theory, no resident should have worked the number of continuous hours I ended up working that week. In practice, the service was already operating on favors, borrowed moonlighters, and the kind of whispered bargaining that begins with educational necessity and ends with somebody sleeping in a call room chair for 90 minutes before admitting 3 more patients. I had been on consults for 2 weeks and knew the rhythm well enough to function without thinking. A page from the emergency department meant agitation, delirium, capacity, or suicidal statements during medical admission screening. A page from transplant usually meant concern about adherence history. Surgical units wanted help when patients became combative after anesthesia or could not stop pulling lines. The medicine floors called for everything. Overnight consult psychiatry was mostly triage, risk assessment, medication recommendations, and deciding what could wait until morning without becoming a lawsuit. That Thursday, I had already completed a full day on service before agreeing to cover an additional overnight because the scheduled resident had spiked a fever and the chief could not find backup. I told myself I could handle it, Everyone told themselves that. You drank bad coffee, ate something from the physician lounge if there was anything left, and moved through the hospital by habit. The building made that easy. Elevators opening to sterile corridors, low conversation outside nursing stations, ventilation pushing dry, cold air even in July. Computer screens reflecting in darkened windows after midnight until the city beyond the glass disappeared. The patient everyone called 9B had been boarding on the medical psychiatry side for several days before I formally inherited him. His legal name in the chart was Elias Voss, though I would later find at least 6 other names attached to nearly identical documentation over the years. He occupied the second bed in room 9 on the older inpatient behavioral medicine unit, a mixed acuity floor used when the dedicated psychiatric beds were full and patients required close medical follow-up. The staff called him 9B the way hospital staff reduce whole biographies to room markers when fatigue outpaces courtesy. According to the sign-out I received at 7 p.m., he was a middle-aged male admitted for disorganized behavior, dehydration, and concern for grave disability after being found sitting for hours in the main hospital atrium. No substances identified, no clear family contacts, intermittently cooperative, no aggression, medically stable. Psychiatry attending had planned discharge to shelter placement with outpatient follow-up once social work confirmed bed availability. That was supposed to happen on the day shift. It had not happened because the discharge order disappeared from the system shortly after it was entered, and by the time anyone noticed, the attending had left, and evening nursing was not comfortable releasing him without a fresh order. That kind of bureaucratic failure was irritating, not ominous. Orders got voided for technical reasons. Pharmacy verification delayed things. Case management notes crossed midnight and confused the status. I assumed I would review him, re-enter the discharge, and move on. I first met him at 8:40 p.m. The unit was in that temporary quiet between medication pass and the first wave of overnight insomnia. One patient was pacing the hall in yellow socks. The television in the day area was muted beneath closed captions no one was reading. A nurse I trusted, Marlene, handed me the chart printout and said the patient had been asking when the resident would arrive. She said it with a slight smile, as if amused he knew the hierarchy mattered. He was sitting up in bed with the overhead light off and the window shade half open behind him. From the doorway he looked older than the chart age, which listed 48. Not gaunt. Not ill in an obvious way. Just overused, like someone who had been carrying poor sleep for years. His gown was tied correctly. His bedside table was clean. The meal tray had been stacked with the utensils aligned. That level of order drew my attention because most boarding patients, through no fault of their own, ended up living inside medical clutter within a day. I introduced myself. He repeated my name once correctly before I offered it a second time. "You are later than usual," he said. I assumed he meant the service in general. I apologized for the delay and began the evaluation. He was awake, attentive, oriented to person, place, month, and year. He denied auditory hallucinations. He denied current suicidal or homicidal thoughts. His speech was normal rate and volume. Thought process appeared linear, though he answered some questions with a slight pause, as if waiting to see whether I would ask them in the expected order. When I asked why he had come to the hospital, he said, "I did not come for treatment. I came because the 4th floor stairwell will be closed at 1:14 a.m. after a transport tech slips on spilled tube feed. If I am discharged before then, your overnight will become harder to document." I wrote that down verbatim because it was the kind of specific oddity that can indicate delusional structure rather than simple confusion. I asked how he knew anything about the 4th floor stairwell. He looked mildly surprised by the question. "It already happened for me," he said. "For you it has not happened yet." Patients make temporal statements all the time. Delirium, mania, psychosis, personality structure, exhaustion. I had heard far stranger things that week alone. I redirected to practical matters. Did he know the plan for discharge? Did he have somewhere safe to go? Did he have outpatient providers? He answered each question sensibly enough, then added details about the rest of my night that had not occurred. At 11:10 p.m., he said, the emergency department would page about a college student with first-break psychosis who would arrive in restraints but calm down once her roommate was allowed in the room. At 12:40 a.m., the transplant floor would request a capacity evaluation that should have waited until morning because the patient would be febrile and confused. At 3 a.m., an attending from medicine would call me by the wrong resident's name while asking for a recommendation already entered in the chart. He delivered all of this without drama, like someone reading weather advisories. I finished the interview, recommended discharge in the morning pending social work confirmation, and entered the order set myself. I watched the order accept. I printed the after-visit paperwork. I told Marlene I would sign the final medication reconciliation once pharmacy cleared the last line. Then my pager went off. Emergency department, agitated young adult, possible first-break psychosis, restraints applied. By the time I reached the emergency bay, the patient was already calming because security had allowed her roommate into the room to translate what the triage nurse had misunderstood as threatening speech. It was 11:12 p.m. That unsettled me in the ordinary way accurate coincidences unsettle anyone who works long enough in a pattern-heavy profession. Hospitals are machines of recurrence. Once you learn the common failures, prediction becomes less mystical and more cynical. I told myself 9B was an observant chronic patient who understood hospital flow from prior admissions. The next two events landed the same way. The transplant consult came at 12:38 a.m. for a patient clearly too encephalopathic for any meaningful capacity assessment. The medicine attending at 3 a.m. did in fact call me by another resident's name while requesting guidance already placed in the chart. With each correct forecast, my irritation with the system increased and my confidence in my own detachment decreased. When I returned to the unit at 3:20 a.m. to finalize the discharge, the order had vanished. Not hidden in pending, not discontinued, gone as if it had never been placed. The nursing task list still showed incomplete discharge education, and the medication reconciliation sat unsigned, but the primary order itself was absent. In its place was a brief progress note under my login time stamped 8:11 a.m. the following morning. Patient remains preoccupied with unit chronology. Given inconsistency in discharge planning and recurrent concern regarding orientation to sequence, recommend continued observation. I had not written it. The note used my usual phrasing closely enough to make denial feel childish. I often wrote preoccupied with when avoiding more loaded terms. I used sequence when documenting temporal disorganization because it read better in interdisciplinary charts. My signature auto-populated correctly. The workroom computer showed no other open sessions under my name. I checked whether one of the senior residents had borrowed my login. No. I checked whether the clock on the workstation was wrong. It matched my phone. I deleted the draft note, logged out, logged back in, and re-entered the discharge order a second time. 9B watched me from his bed while I worked at the room terminal. "You will get to the pager log before sign out," he said. "That helps for a little while." I told him he should focus on getting some sleep. He smiled without mockery. That advice has always mattered less here than people pretend. The rest of that night blurred at the edges the way every post-call stretch eventually did. Bright chart windows, half-heard conversations. The sensation of moving quickly while time dragged around me. At 5:30 a.m., I saw environmental services cleaning a spill near the fourth-floor stairwell. A transport tech stood nearby with a wrapped wrist and a paper cup of water. I did not ask questions. Morning sign-out happened in the consult room with stale bagels, a whiteboard full of names, and everyone trying to compress suffering into bullet points before day teams scattered. When I mentioned the disappearing discharge order, the chief resident frowned and said there had been similar glitches all week after an electronic record update. When I mentioned the future-dated note, he said auto-save drafts sometimes displayed incorrectly across sessions. When I mentioned the patient's accurate predictions, the fellow asked how much I had slept. That was a fair question, which made it useful as dismissal. I was scheduled off after sign-out. Instead, I stayed because the resident covering the next night had been pulled to the emergency service, and the attending asked whether I could bridge until Moonlighter coverage started. I should have said no. My thoughts were already developing the strange hollow speed that comes right before real cognitive decline. But everyone else looked worse than I felt, and residency teaches you to misinterpret self-endangerment as teamwork. By the second overnight, 9B had become the fixed point around which the rest of the hospital seemed to rotate. His discharge paperwork had again vanished. Social work insisted they had never received a discharge plan. Pharmacy showed no record of the medications I had reconciled. Marlene swore I had come back to the unit around noon, spoken with the attending outside the room, and agreed the patient needed another day of observation because his narrative had grown more organized rather than less. I had no memory of being on the unit at noon. At noon, I believed I had been asleep in the call room for perhaps an hour before getting paged back to the emergency department. I checked my badge log. It showed entry to the unit at 11:58 a.m. I checked the cafeteria receipt in my pocket because small receipts sometimes help anchor real-time the way calendars do not. It was stamped 1:22 p.m. for a turkey sandwich I did not remember buying. During my second interview with 9B, he asked whether I had found the old handover notes yet. I asked what handover notes. The ones residents keep when the chart stops being enough, he said. Pagers remember better than attendings, but paper remembers longest. Try the call room desk that still sticks in humid weather. There were 3 call rooms assigned to psychiatry. One had a desk drawer that stuck every summer because the wood swelled. I knew that immediately, and I hated that he knew I would know it. I waited until after midnight and searched it. In the back of the drawer, beneath spare consent forms and an unplugged pager charger, I found a stack of folded sign-out sheets bound by a rubber band turned brittle with age. The top pages were recent enough to make sense. Cross-cover lists, brief notes about difficult families, reminders to follow lithium levels or repeat electrocardiograms. Deeper in the stack, the handwriting changed. Different years, different resident names. Same room marker appearing again and again. 9B, hold discharge pending reassessment. 9B asking about events prior to occurrence. 9B states he has already met day team. 9B under alias, likely same presentation as prior cycle. The earliest sheet I found was photocopied so many times the letters had blurred at the edges. It appeared to date from the late 1990s. The room number was different because the unit layout had changed after renovation, but the comment at the bottom was unmistakable. Patient identifies resident before introduction and references pages not yet received. Recommend not interviewing alone after second overnight. I sat on the call room bed and read until the words began to detach from meaning. Over decades of handovers, different residents had described the same man under different names and ages. Some called him lucid, some called him bizarre. Several noted that discharge plans repeatedly failed because orders disappeared, legal paperwork reset, or transport arrived for the wrong patient. A few residents believed staff were unconsciously perpetuating the admission because the patient had become institutionally familiar. 2 believed the patient represented a shared delusion produced by call schedule culture and sleep loss. One line, written in careful block letters by someone whose name I recognized from an attending plaque in the conference room, unsettled me more than any of the others. If he starts describing your sign out before it happens, leave the building before morning rounds. Before I went back upstairs, I called the overnight bed manager and asked as casually as I could when room 9 had last been renovated. She sounded annoyed by the question but pulled the facility's summary. According to her screen, the current room numbers dated only to the 2018 remodel, when half the unit had been renumbered after the nurses' station moved. Older charts, she said, would not map cleanly onto the current layout. Then she stopped talking for a second and asked why there was still an active designation in the legacy system for bed 9B if the room had once been converted to storage. I logged into the older paging archive used before the hospital switched vendors. Residents almost never checked it because the interface looked like tax software from another decade, but it still stored callback summaries entered by operators. Searching the bed designation instead of the patient name brought up dozens of entries. Not all were psychiatric. Some were medicine, neurology, even surgery. Yet the language repeated with eerie consistency. Reevaluate before discharge. Await clarification from prior team. Patient states resident already knows the sequence. The oldest operator note I found was from 1998. Callback completed. Resident sounded confused. Will return after rounds that have not happened. I printed those entries and compared them with my own pager history. Several callback numbers matched extensions that no longer existed, including one for an observation desk removed during renovation. But the audit trail showed the same thing every time. Someone received the page. Someone called back. Someone documented a plan to keep 9B until morning. The names changed. The service changed. The decision never did. That was when fatigue stopped feeling like cause and started feeling recruited. I did not leave. Not because I was brave, because the hospital had already narrowed my thinking into task lists. Finish note, return page, review labs, reassess patient. Fatigue does that. It reduces fear into workflow until the impossible has a checkbox beside it. Around 2 a.m., I went back to 9B and asked him directly who he was. He was lying on his side facing the window. The city lights beyond the glass reflected faintly in the dark pane, making it look as though another room existed on the other side with its own dim staff movement. I am whoever the unit can keep long enough to stabilize the schedule, he said. Sometimes that is a patient. Sometimes it is the resident assigned to discharge him. Usually there is overlap before anybody notices. I told him that made no clinical sense. Clinical sense is for notes, he said. This is operational. He sat up and gestured toward the hallway where monitors beeped softly and a nurse laughed at something said too quietly for me to hear. You think the hospital keeps people because they are sick, he said. Mostly it keeps them because they fit somewhere in the sequence. A bed, a roll, a handoff. If a discharge breaks the sequence often enough, the system learns to refuse it. I asked why everyone else seemed willing to ignore that. He considered me with something like pity. They are not ignoring it. They are inside it at different speeds. My pager vibrated before I could respond. Consult request from the emergency department for a man found in the atrium after sitting motionless for hours. Unknown identity, cooperative, no obvious intoxication. I stared at the screen until it timed out. When I looked back up, 9B said, "That one will be me on a slower week. Tonight they are trying something else." I left the room and nearly walked into my attending, Dr. Levin, who should not have been in the building until morning. He handed me a cup of coffee and asked whether I had finalized the recommendation we discussed. I said we had not discussed anything. He blinked, looked tired, and said, "In the workroom, 10 minutes ago. You told me he starts to destabilize if we push the discharge after a second overnight." I had not been in the workroom with him, unless I had. There are states of sleep deprivation where time stops feeling linear and begins presenting as overlapping fragments you arrange by confidence rather than certainty. I knew that academically. Standing there with hot coffee in my hand, I knew it physically. I checked the consult pager logs. Each page was time-stamped, and old messages remained reviewable for several days. Scrolling backward, I found entries I remembered and entries I did not. A return call to Dr. Levin placed at 1:42 a.m. the previous night discussing continued admission for 9B. A page from social work acknowledged by me at 2:15 p.m. while I believed I had been asleep. An outgoing text through the secure messaging system to Marlene that read, "Keep him until I confirm the sequence." That was my wording, my abbreviation habits, my misspelling of confirm corrected by autocorrect. I went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the over-air-conditioned hallway. At 4:30 a.m., after another consult I barely completed, I returned to room 9 intending to place an involuntary hold if only to create paperwork stable enough to force review by someone above me. The bed was empty. The room terminal still displayed his chart. The blanket was folded. A fresh wristband lay on the mattress, unfastened. Not Elias Voss. My name, last name first, hospital formatting, service, psychiatry. The unit clerk called from the desk to ask whether I could come sign an admission packet because security had just brought up an unidentified male from the atrium, and the emergency department was overwhelmed. I walked to the desk, feeling as though the floor had thinned under my shoes. The packet on the counter listed pending room assignment. Provisional bed hold, 9B. The chief complaint section was blank except for one sentence entered in triage comments. Patient states he has already been discharged several times and requests to speak with the resident covering the second overnight. I asked the clerk who entered that. She said it came through with the transfer note. I asked where the patient was. She pointed down the hall. A transport aide was wheeling someone toward room 9. From where I stood with the fluorescent lights flattening distance and my own reflection faint in the glass of the medication room, I could not see the patient's face. I only saw a man sitting upright on the stretcher, hands resting neatly on the blanket, as if conserving energy for a familiar conversation. Marlene said my name twice before I answered. She asked whether I was all right because I looked pale. Then she said, in the careful tone nurses use when deciding whether a doctor is becoming unsafe, that maybe I should sit down before sign out. I wish I could tell you I walked out of the hospital then and never returned. What happened was smaller and for that reason worse. I sat in the workroom, opened the chart, and found a note already waiting under my login. It was not future dated. It was current. The wording was concise, competent, and devastatingly calm. Resident increasingly uncertain whether patient chronology is primary pathology or acquired feature of prolonged exposure to service. Recommend transfer of decision-making at earliest safe opportunity. Below that was a handoff note addressed to the day team. If he asks whether this is his second overnight, do not answer immediately. I took a leave of absence 3 days later after misplacing an entire afternoon and waking in a call room with my pager battery removed. Officially, I cited exhaustion. Unofficially, I was afraid that if I completed one more sign-out on that service, the distinction between evaluator and patient would become administrative rather than real. My program director was kinder than I expected. He said residency can deform time. He said hospitals create their own weather. He said no one thinks clearly after enough consecutive nights. I did not argue. There are explanations you accept because they are merciful, not because they are true. I still have the photocopied handover sheets. Every few months I read them and notice some sentence I somehow missed before. The names change. The decade changes. The language modernizes. But the pattern does not. There is always a boarded patient who should have left. There is always a resident too tired to trust his own sequence of days. And there is always, near the bottom of the page, some version of the same warning. Do not let the unit decide who is easiest to keep. Once a place like that learns your schedule, it does not need your consent to put you back into it.